Think of China as like a giant VC fund that is just willing to lose huge amounts of money for a really long time on the assumption that a few of the bets will pan out. They're not successful enough. I thought one of the problems in the world that we're facing today is that they're too successful at too many things, and that this is creating difficulties for other people. Well, I think one of the things, I often describe China as a very turbulent and very deep ocean. So you skim along the top and you see the huge waves, right? So all the stuff that's been built. And then you go below that and there's a very deep, still ocean. And their answer is not, you build a block, I'll build a block against that. Their answer is, I will operate so that it is impossible for you to build the block that you want.
大家好，今天要分享的是今年6月，美国著名的财经记者和经济分析师、中国问题专家阿瑟·克鲁伯一段访谈的节选。阿瑟·克鲁伯，中文名葛艺豪，可能更为人所知。他是国际学界与商界公认的中国问题权威。自1985年首次踏入中国起，他以经济学家的专业视角和中美双栖的生活经历，持续追踪中国经济与社会变迁近40年。作为长期往返于中美两地的研究者，他既见证了中国从计划经济向市场经济转型的关键节点，也深度参与了对中国产业政策、经济结构的学术分析与实践观察。其观点因为兼具局内人的细节洞察与局外人的客观审视而备受关注。葛艺豪长期为外交政策、经济学人、远东经济评论、财富杂志撰稿，为金融时报、华尔街日报及华盛顿邮报撰写评论专栏。他还是美国外交关系委员会和美中关系全国委员会的成员，以及北京清华布鲁金斯全球政策研究中心的高级研究员。在这一段访谈中，葛艺豪跳出单一经济数据，从制度逻辑、社会文化与全球互动的维度解读中国发展。他对中国汽车业、可再生能源等战略产业的跟踪研究，不仅梳理了产业崛起的脉络，更揭示了中国政策制定的底层逻辑。而对中美关系的分析，也始终以务实共存为核心，拒绝非黑即白的对抗思维，为理解中美经济竞合提供了重要参考。我们来看看他是怎么说的。
It's funny because one of the main arguments that China hawks will make, or one of the big parts of the worldview, is that China really cheated us by our companies would invest in China,
right,
build up factories in China, the technology would get transferred there. And this was like a huge arbitrage that China was able to pull. And so if you actually believe that, it should just make the reverse of that incredibly compelling.
Yes.
Because you get a chance to do that again.
Yes, right.
Do you want to tell the story of BYD and Tesla in 2018 and 2019? Because I think this really illustrates the point, or what could be done in reverse, very well.
Right. So if you go back to the early 1990s, China recognized that pretty much every other country that had gotten rich had done so in large part by building up an automotive industry that then served as a mechanism for creating innovations in other sectors. You look at the US, you look at Germany, you look at Japan, you look even at Korea, which is very successful. So they said, okay, we have to have a big auto industry. This is one of the key industries that we have to support. So starting in the early 1990s, they had this strategy of bringing in foreign companies, making them do joint ventures on a 50-50 basis with Chinese auto companies. And the theory was that eventually the Chinese companies would learn, and then you would be able to, develop your own national champion auto companies and, kick the foreigners out, right? And basically this failed. It failed massively. Over the next 25 years, foreign companies came in, General Motors, VW, Toyota, Honda, and so forth. And they did very, very well. And the joint venture partners in China basically just sat around and clipped coupons from the dividends that these joint ventures were producing. All of the technological inputs continuously came from the foreign partners. All of the design ideas that the local partners just were never able to succeed. And in volume terms, you had a lot of smaller scale, locally sponsored vehicle companies in China. building kind of low-end vehicles. So a lot of the cars that wound up getting made in China were made by local firms. But if you look at the share of profits and total value in the system, it was dominated by these joint ventures, which were in turn dominated by the foreign partners. So China, circa 2010, 2015 had been doing this for 25 years, and they were basically no closer to having globally competitive conventional car makers than they had been 25 years before. So in the late 2000s, so 2005, 2010, they started thinking, well, this and other related kind of industrial policies are not working very well. We are not generating the national champions that we thought that we were going to do. So what do we do about this? And their answer was leapfrog. Let's try and figure out what is the next stage of technological development that people really aren't working on yet. Let's work on that, and then maybe we can get in on the ground floor. And so what they came up with, in large measure, was renewable energy, specifically electric vehicles. So they started having a pretty comprehensive set of subsidies and other kinds of industrial support for companies like BYD to produce electric vehicles. BYD is basically a private company.
Right.
This worked okay for 10 or 12 years, and BYD got pretty good. And particularly what they started to figure out was the supply chain. So they got very good at making the batteries. But still, when you got to 2018, 2019, BYD was still not that exciting a company. Most people in China really didn't want to buy electric vehicles. They seemed really inconvenient. The sexy cars were like the big SUVs that the joint ventures were putting out and so forth. And then in 2018, the Chinese government made the decision that they would allow Tesla to come in and build a wholly owned gigafactory in Shanghai. They had never approved a wholly owned automotive company before. They started cranking out cars in 2019, which became immensely popular. And it seems like one of the things that happened was that the Chinese companies by 2019 had gotten pretty good at the underlying technology of electric cars, specifically the batteries and then the software systems that governed the cars. But they were terrible at consumer design. They had not figured out how to make these appealing products that people would want to buy. And Tesla did have appealing products that people wanted to buy. They were big status symbols. So BYD and its competitors said, okay, this is the part we have to figure out. How do we achieve this? And basically, they recognized that they had to up their design game. They, among other things, went to Germany and loaded up on a lot of German car designers that were able to transform their kind of technology base into much more appealing packages. And then by 2022 or so, they were, able to compete with Tesla both on price and on quality. So, I think what that shows you is that, number one, the Chinese government made a pretty good bet on this kind of leapfrogging idea that there are technologies of the future. We need to get in early, subsidize the heck out of them. Some of the estimates that have been made about the level of subsidies given to the EV industry and related supply chains, it's $200 or $300 billion, huge amounts of money that did not generate that much of a return, financial return, for a really long time. But they stuck at it. And then the thing that finally flipped the switch was this catalytic foreign investment that showed the Chinese companies what they needed to do to actually compete in the consumer market. And then they got very good at that very quickly.
How much was the $200-300 billion actually relevant, given the fact that BYD, as you mentioned, is a private company?
Yeah.
Was that all, how much of that was actually necessary or counterfactually important to creating this outcome?
I think the thing is, it's like the old slogan about advertising, half of it works, but you don't know which half. Mm-hmm. Yeah, did China need to spend that much in subsidies? Probably not, right? But had they spent less, would they have had the same effect? Maybe not. They tried various different types of subsidies. So initially there were producer subsidies to just get companies to produce more. Then they had a lot of buyer subsidies, so at the individual level, but also the city government level to promote, things like electric buses. And so I think all of that played a role. And I think what was important was that the government set a very clear direction, and they said, we want this to happen, and we really want it. And we don't know how long it's going to take. And we're just going to keep trying different things until it works, because the goal of creating this electric vehicle sector and the whole supply chain for it, that's what we want at the end.
And why are they able to identify these kinds of sectors in advance? Because I don't know, central planning isn't supposed to work, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, and there's been many cases of countries which have tried to do this. Germany, Japan, many other countries missed out on the internet because there was a centrally directed effort towards these heavy industries or manufacturing, which actually turned out not to be relevant in the 21st century.
Yeah. No, it's definitely perilous. So if you look at, China has a list of key industries. It's called the Strategic Emerging Industries. They came up with it basically in 2010. It built on previous iterations of industrial policy. Most of it is not really an effort to predict with high degree of specificity what comes next. They're mostly pretty obvious things like semiconductors, industrial automation, new materials, all this kind of stuff that I think would be on anyone's list if you were just sort of running a VC fund and saying, what are the sectors that we think are...
But most VC funds are like losing money. And so it actually is maybe a couple of firms in the world which are able to make this prediction correctly.
Yeah.
So it's a couple firms in the world plus the Ministry of Information Technology in China are the only people who can predict the future.
No. I mean, I think basically the analogy with the VC fund is a pretty good one. I've made it many times. Think of China as like a giant VC fund that is just willing to lose huge amounts of money for a really long time on the assumption that a few of the bets will pan out. Right. And so China as a state, as a government, is uniquely able to throw a lot of money at things for a really long time, not care about what the returns are, and say, we're going to identify this universe of potential winners. We're going to, promote all of them, basically. And some of them may work and some of them may not. Yeah. And the successes will pay for the failures.
I guess I'm still confused on why many other countries have tried similar things. Like Needy was a Japanese version of this, right?
Yeah.
So look at their economy now and their high-tech sector.
So a couple things. So first of all, I would say that even if you go back to 2005, 2006, when they started thinking about this, saying that green energy was going to be an important industry in the future, everyone was saying that, right? You had the Kleiner Perkins guy, John Doerr, right? John Doerr was the big VC who said, circa 2007, I'm going to put all of my bets on green energy because this is the future, right? He turned out to be wrong from the standpoint of his investment returns. But he turned out to be, I think, totally correct in terms of saying this is a really big thing. So, it was just not that wild a bet to say that green energy was going to be really important. And so we should place a lot of bets on that. So, but why does this work? And why is this different from a central planning thing, right? I think that's a really important point. So a couple things. So first of all, the Chinese system, like the systems that preceded it in East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, so forth, has always put a lot of emphasis on being good at exporting. So there are a lot of pressures within the system to create industries that can export, right? The reason this is important is if you have a totally closed system, which frankly is what I think Donald Trump is trying to create in the United States, and people are just producing essentially for domestic consumption, there's no incentive to keep up with global technology developments. So if you have this constant export focus, essentially what everyone is trying to do, if you have a closed domestic market, you can rig the domestic market and buy off your connections in government to make sure that you as a company have your market share. So there are a lot of ways to win that do not involve technological upgrading. And that is what dooms all import substitution regimes. If you have an export-driven economy, you can't rig the global economy. Ultimately, you have to compete. right? And you can't compete just on price. You have to compete on raising your game. And Japan did this successfully. Taiwan did this successfully. Korea did this successfully. China's done that successfully. So that's answer one, is that you had this underlying system which was heavily incentivized in technological upgrading across the board. So that's what you were sitting on top of. And it was completely different than the old central planning regime, which was autarkic and inward looking. Right? Second, you had this domestic competition environment, which was really cutthroat and which involved a lot of international companies, right? And this is a little bit of a difference to Japan, which always kept the foreign companies out of its domestic market. Their companies operated globally, very, very well, but the domestic market was very protected. China's domestic market was not that protected. And so they were always willing to bring in companies that they thought would be able to, spark some technological change. And again, you can say, so what this did is it created a field in which maybe the government has the right ideas, maybe they don't, but you have a crucible in which their ideas can be tested. A very competitive domestic market where you have a lot of the big international players doing their own thing as well. And so that the things that work get some validation and you can keep building on those successes. So I think that's a really important, and then just the sheer scale at which they were able and willing to support, what appeared to be losing bets for a long time, does matter, right? And you could contrast their view, for example, in solar energy, where they said, look, we want to be big in solar energy. And again, they started thinking about this in 2005. What do we need to do? So they identified the whole supply chain from the raw silicon inputs through all of the modules and to the finished panels. And they said, we want to be in every stage of that. So they had a pretty deliberate strategy of trying to create people at every point in the supply chain. And they were willing to go through cycles of people not making any money. Comparison, obviously, in the United States is the U.S. government gives one loan to one company, Solyndra. It goes bad, and everyone says, this is proof that industrial policy does not work, right? And I think China actually has the right answer to that question, and we had the wrong answer to that question. You have to be willing to accept some failures and some loss of, government money along the way if you want to get to the end. But I really stress the ecosystem, because a lot of this would not have worked just by the government saying, oh, we want to do solar. It would not have worked unless you had this broader ecosystem of export-driven manufacturing, high competition, and international participation across many, 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 many sectors of the economy. They all converged to create a successful result.
Yeah. I want to put some of these bureaucrats in a Factorio speedrun and see how they do. I think the valence of things you've said so far has been, look, they've been remarkably competent, even at the things which economists criticize them most for the majority of the period of these schemes. They've actually worked out quite well. For example, this local government financing through land sales on estimated future income and so forth. And then obviously we were talking about Chinese industry and how that's been successful in many key sectors. So I guess a big picture question I have is, if that's true, look, I mean, they're still at like a fifth of American national income per capita, a third of similar countries in East Asia, like Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So how do we explain the relative poverty on a per capita basis in China? How do we explain obviously bad decisions like zero COVID?
Right.
I guess I'm having trouble squaring the circle of like, if they're making all these great calls.
Yes.
Why isn't China more successful?
They're not successful enough. I thought one of the problems in the world that we're facing today is that they're too successful at too many things, and that this is creating difficulties for other people. So yeah, that has come up, from time to time, and during the period in the 90s and 2000s where they're growing at 10% a year, which is the fastest growth rate recorded by any economy in the history of mankind. And they were doing it just not for 1 or 2 years, but for 20 years in a row. People will often say, well, there's all this waste and there's too much state-owned enterprises, and they could grow much faster if they were just more efficient. And it's like, really? Could they? They're already growing faster than anyone has grown before.
Right.
Is it really the case that they could have grown a lot faster than they have? And maybe, but I doubt it. And the reason is, I think there's what I would call kind of an efficiency fallacy, which is that economists who, remember, have all been basically, all global economists, macroeconomists have been trained in the United States, since the end of World War II and in particularly since, the 1990s, right? And so they view sort of the U.S. in its developed state as the norm, rather than as the result of other processes. So it's like the way we operate now is the way we got here. And actually, that's not quite the case, right? The reason China was able to grow so fast for so long was that they were able to mobilize these huge swaths of resources, domestic savings, and throw them in a kind of uncoordinated way at a lot of problems. And there was a lot of waste along the way. That was part of the equation. So if they had tried to be maximally efficient and said, no, we're not going to allow banks to lend unless they can prove that this project is definitely going to have an ROI of X, they would have lended a lot less. And they would probably have had a lot less growth because they were not willing simply to create that wall of money that would create broad-based growth. And they might, in fact, have had substantially more inequality than they did because this wasteful method allowed them to spread out investment in a lot of areas which were geographically disadvantaged, which might not have done so well in a purely efficiency-driven system. So I think we need to be careful about assuming that inefficiency is bad. I think inefficiency sometimes can be, as long as it is basically the result of a desire to be effective, that can be sort of a byproduct of a successful growth story. And I think that's basically my account of China.
Is it your quote in the book something like, at a country of China's scale, what matters not is efficiency of using the resources, but effectiveness of achieving outcomes? Basically,
that's my basic thesis. Yeah. And I think they've shown that this works quite well. And I think that's also part of the answer to why aren't they richer on a per capita basis? Well, there are 1.4 billion people. It is just gigantic. If you just think about the scale problem, right? Taiwan, Korea, South Korea, they got to whatever they are relative to US per capita GDP, 60, 70%, something like that, within a generation or two, because Taiwan, they had 20 million people. South Korea, they had 40, 45 million people. To move that number of people and get them all working in high-wage industrial or service jobs in urban areas, you can do that in the course of a generation, right? 20, 25 years. I just think it's physically impossible to achieve that on the scale that China's been operating on of 1.4 billion people. You look at the urban migration that they've done, it is completely unprecedented in the history of humanity, the speed at which they have converted people from rural residents into urban residents. For many, many years, they were urbanizing at the rate of 20 million people a year added to the urban population. I forget the precise calculation that I made, but in terms of they were effectively, in terms of housing and urban infrastructure, they were building the equivalent of, I think, I calculated New York plus Philadelphia plus San Francisco every single year for 20 years, right? No one has ever done anything like this before. And so I think what this tells you, the lesson of this is that there's an arithmetic problem there, that even if you do this on this unprecedented scale and do it faster and bigger than anyone has done it before, if you're trying to move 1.4 billion people into an income of United States level, it just takes a really, really long time. Yeah. Right. And now, of course, what's happened is because they have, I think, gone too far off the deep end of industrial policy and the supply side will solve all of our problems. Growth has slowed down quite a bit in the last few years. It's probably well below potential. I don't think that there's a lot of evidence that China's growth was below potential from from 2000 until 2020 on average. I think there's a lot of evidence that it's below potential now, and so they are sacrificing the ability of the average Chinese person to do more rapid catch up with the living standards of the West in order to achieve these industrial policy technology goals.
You first went to China in 1980, and you've been
85.
And you've been visiting and living there on and off ever since.
Right.
I mean, we're all aware that obviously China's developed a lot since then and so forth. But like, what are some non-obvious changes you've seen, or maybe even things that have stayed the same through all this change?
Well, I think one of the things I often describe China as a very turbulent and very deep ocean. So you skim along the top and you see the huge waves, right? So all the stuff that's been built, all of the, cities, the high rises, the industrial parks, the high-speed rail, and so forth. And then you go below that and there's a very deep, still ocean of ideas, concepts, bureaucratic tendencies, and so forth that have built up over centuries. That, in a lot of ways, does not change that much. So, a simple example on this is how to make that more concrete. If I think about what the United States was like socially in 1985 compared to what it is today in terms of the space for gay and lesbian people, trans people, social acceptance of different lifestyles, awareness and attention paid to racial issues, all these kinds of things. We were the changes that have occurred in the United States over the last 40 years, I think, are substantially greater than the changes that have occurred in China over that same time period in terms of people's fundamental understandings of how do we interact together in a society. And partly that just reflects that the U.S. is intrinsically a somewhat more complex society than China, with all of these layers of races, the whole immigrant experience that was just in terms of the number of foreign-born people was much lower in 85 than it was today. But socially, we are much more. There's just been a lot more change and a lot more, I would say, evolution of people's basic attitudes towards, what they think about society and how we should interact. China, in that sense, I think has been more stable. It's more cohesive. It's more attached to rather deep-rooted notions of gender relations, patriarchy, sort of how the society should hang together. So that, as we think about all of the change that's occurred in China, which is real, and some of it, the changes in social relations that has come with the essentially abolition of the planned economy system and the replacement with this basically capitalist system with a Leninist political carapace, those are very significant, right? So I don't want to underestimate how much transformation has gone on in China over that period. I think it's been substantial. But in the U.S., it's been, I think, in many ways, even more. There's a kind of intrinsic churning dynamism to the American system that is just always there, is often very uncomfortable to live through, and we're living through, I think, a very particularly uncomfortable moment now. And in China, there's some of that, but there's a lot of containment, and there's more stasis in a lot of the kind of fundamental, sort of social relationships. So I lived in China more or less full time until 2015. And then I started doing half and half after that. Now I principally live in New York. One of the things that always struck me when I would come back from China to the US is just how much grassroots cultural activity you have all over the United States, right? We have a very distributed sort of system of sort of cultural activity here. And in China, you have a few sort of big cultural hotspots where things happen, and then it's all kind of placid, right? So the sort of the variety of experience that you have in the U.S., I think, is still unrivaled. And I think you were talking earlier about there's still this huge discrepancy between, the average income in China and the average income in the U.S. This is partly a reflection of that, right? It's still, on average, a much poorer society in the U.S. than the U.S. And so the surplus that's available for people to do stuff that's interesting, but not sort of economically productive in a narrow sense, that space is still a lot smaller. And it's not just political repression that's doing that. It's kind of like it's a combination of the level of income and just like the ingrained social structures.
Yeah. Final question. Right now, obviously, the U.S. and China are engaged in this negotiation to figure out some somewhat stable coming back from Liberation Day. What is the most positive, plausible story of what comes out of this?
Well, my expectations for this are very low because I think the basic problem here is that we have, on the U.S. side, we have a sort of a collection of grievances and complaints that have not coalesced into a very coherent agenda of what we want from ourselves and what we want from China. And if you don't know what you yourself want and you don't know what you want from the other party, it's very hard to engage in a constructive negotiation. So I think that's my fundamental take on where we are right now. To me, what we should be, so this is a normative statement, what we should be aiming for is trying to figure out what are the terms of coexistence between the U.S. and China in the coming years and decades. The most desirable outcome would be some kind of an agreement under which we create a broader permission structure for Chinese companies to invest in the United States in a lot of these key industries that we're talking about. I think that's good for the United States because I think it is reasonable for us to try and rebuild certain aspects of our industrial manufacturing system. I think we let those atrophy too much. So selectively, I think it does make sense for us to try and rebuild that. And rebuilding that, should incorporate the best anywhere in the world. And some of that is now coming from China. And I also think just in terms of enhancing mutual understanding and getting better communication channels, investment is, even more than trade, is a very good communication channel because it forces you to go to the other guy's place and put down roots there and figure out how things work and figure out ways to communicate with one another. Now, the obstacles to that are enormous, both because of the U.S. narrative that this is intrinsically unsafe and because, I think the Chinese will be very reluctant to allow a lot of their technology high flyers to go and set up in the U.S. and risk having their technology leak away there too. So I'm not saying that is easy or achievable. It's certainly not in a few months. This would be over the course of a year or two or three. You might be able to negotiate some terms of engagement there, right? I mean, the big problem I think that China creates for the world as a whole right now is this fact that they just are unwilling or unable to generate enough domestic demand to keep their own economy running at full steam. That's bad for their own economy, and it creates a lot of friction in the rest of the world because what it then means is that companies that can't sell in China are forced to export their surplus production, and this creates, rising trade frictions, not just with the United States, but with lots and lots of countries. And it does sort of contribute to the narrative that China is not really all that interested in creating a situation where everyone benefits from their growth. It's much more of we're in this for ourselves. So I think it would be helpful for the world economy, helpful for the Chinese people, and helpful for general, stability if the Chinese could recognize that they need to do a lot more to promote the demand side of their economy. It can't just all be about endless investments in new technologies. And I think they're coming to a point where they may be forced into that, because if you look at most of the metrics that I and my team follow of, return on investment in China, they're going down, right? The number of zombie companies that, still exist, but, don't even generate enough revenue to pay the interest cost on their debt, that's going up. There's a lot of pressure that's building within the Chinese system because of this obsessive concern with the supply side of the economy. So they'll continue to do, I think, quite well overall in technology production, but the financial constraints are rising. So they, I think, have some self-interest here in coming up with a more balanced economic model and having some pressure from the outside to get them in that direction. I think that would be good. But I guess the final point I would make on this, though, is on the U.S. side, which is, of course, where I generally sit, it really is critical to have a realistic understanding of what's happening in China and how they're interacting with the rest of the world. So I think one of the big dangers that we have in the current Trump administration strategy in this, which was also to some degree apparent in the Biden administration strategy, was there is this belief that China can be contained and that you can essentially construct an alliance of countries that will stand up to China and try to constrain it with you. It's kind of a replay or a dusting off of the Cold War playbook, where you had the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, you had the United States and NATO and all of the informal allies everywhere else, and you had the blocs against each other, and the bigger and more economically productive bloc won, right? And that is just not going to work, because the Chinese have seen this coming for a long time. They have long had the view that the U.S. was going to try and constrain them. And they said, well, how do we get around this? And their answer is not, you build a block, I'll build a block against that. Their answer is, I will operate so that it is impossible for you to build the block that you want. So you look at China's international engagements, more countries have China as their number one trade partner than any other country in the world, right? 140 countries trade more with China than they do with the United States, which was not true during the Cold War. So if you go to Southeast Asia, you go to Latin America, and you say, how would you like to join our anti-China alliance? They will say, no way. This makes no sense for me. I import a lot of my industrial inputs from China, a lot of my consumer goods. This is really a critical relationship. I might have some concerns about the trade balance and blah, 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 but I am not going to go up against this country that is now either my number one or my number two economic partner, certainly on the trade side and increasingly on the investment side. So that is a non-viable strategy. It will never work. China has integrated itself into the global economy very successfully. And this is just like a fact that we need to live with. So we need to have a more a strategy that recognizes this is a reality, that there are a lot of strengths that the U.S. has to bear if it's willing to, play them, and that we have the advantages of a dynamic system and, frankly, a lot more sort of creativity and flexibility in our financial system than the Chinese do. So it's perfectly possible to come up with a coexistence scenario in which we do really well. We have domestic policies that sort out our own imbalances, both economic and social. And we have a significant degree of engagement with China that is competitive, but hopefully can be bounded so that we don't wind up in a hot conflict situation, which would be the worst of all possible worlds.
葛艺豪在访谈中提出的中国战略产业规划类似巨型风投基金，是对中国产业政策逻辑的精准类比。这一观点打破了外界对中央计划的刻板印象，也揭示了其成功的关键密码。他指出，中国的战略产业布局，比如2010年确定的战略性新兴产业清单，并非精准预测未来， 而是像风投基金一样，对所有可能成功的领域加以推动，接受大量项目亏损，只靠少数成功领域弥补损失。以电动汽车产业为例，中国政府的大力投入在很长一段时间里都没有产生多少财务回报，但仍然坚持推动。这种不计短期得失的投入，正是普通风投基金或其他国家难以复制的优势。葛艺豪甚至直言，可以把这理解为中国特有的一种制度优势。在美国人眼里的低效，不过是中国成功增长历程中的一种副产品而已。解读葛艺豪的访谈，本质上是对中国模式与中美关系的理性祛魅。他既肯定中国产业规划的长期主义与开放竞争逻辑，也不回避其效率浪费与需求短板，既指出美国战略的模糊性与冷战思维陷阱，也强调中美需要接受彼此融入全球经济的现实。我认为这份解读的价值不仅在于理解中国汽车业崛起等个案，更在于看清在中美竞争的大背景下，对抗并非必然，共存需要双方放下预设。中国需要平衡技术升级与需求增长，美国需要明确自身目标与合作边界。唯有如此，才能避免热冲突的最坏结果，让两国在竞争中找到共赢的空间。